Welcome to Washington in Focus Daily. It is Thursday, May 14th, 2026. I'm Carlene Johnson, the Center Square's state government reporter. And in today's episode, Venice AI founder Jesse Proudman shares why he's gotten so involved in the fight against the income tax, partnering with Let's Go Washington on their initiative campaign aimed at getting a repeal of the income tax before voters in November. Did you hear what former Washington Governor Chris Gregoire recently had to say about Washington's anti-business, bloated budget shenanigans? Now, if you've been in this state for any length of time, you know that former Governor Gregoire is a Democrat. But she too sees the taillights exiting our state in mass, and she had some very interesting comments during the Association of Washington Businesses Spring Summit last week. We're going to bring you that. Then my colleagues TJ Martinell and Tim Clauser with an update on our Center Square exclusive with emails that we obtained last month, showing the collusion really between Senator Jamie Peterson, the Kraft sponsor of the income tax legislation, Senate Bill 6346, and the AG's office, and how the income tax should be crafted in a way to avoid a public referendum and skirt a vote of the people, and also make sure that they could push this at a time now when they're most likely to get a favorable ruling from the very left-leaning Washington State Supreme Court. And then the wait continues to find out if a federal judge is going to move Washington's legislative district maps back to where they were just 2 years ago in 2024, before this same judge racially gerrymandered districts and moved a whole lot of lawmakers in and out of various districts. This has been a real issue for the last couple of weeks since the U.S. Supreme Court ruling in a case out of Louisiana. It has thrown things into a tailspin, and not just here in Washington, several other states already acting. Now pressure mounting on this federal judge to act, as we have a primary coming up in August. So let's dive in. Venice AI founder Jesse Proudman has been in Washington State for all of his adult life. He's 41 now. He's been here 28 years, and Venice AI is his third startup. He started his first company when he was 13 years old. Pretty remarkable, very, very bright guy. And I had a chance to interview him today. He loves Washington, and he's very involved in giving back in his community. Still got a couple of kids that are in schools here, and he doesn't want to leave. But the income tax, he says, for him is, the straw that broke the camel's back. So he is partnering with Let's Go Washington on their initiative, which was launched 2 days ago here in Washington. So I asked him today, why get involved in this and why put yourself out there and go public? Why not just, relocate and stay out of the fight?
I really like it here, and I don't really want to move. And I sort of had the realization that there were two paths. Either I just quietly packed up and left like everybody else is doing, or I became vocal, and nobody else. There are a number of other folks, but not a large population is willing to stick their neck out or have the conversation, and felt like somebody needed to start. So here I am. Yeah, I grew up in Tacoma. I've been a lifelong Washingtonian. I've started multiple businesses here. I started my first business because the startup climate in Seattle in the dot-com era was so vibrant and exciting, and that got me fired up. You get entrepreneurs excited about entrepreneurship when there are entrepreneurs around, and so over the last 28 years, I've done my best to be part of the Seattle ecosystem and to kind of pay it back to other entrepreneurs. And then in the midst of, it really seems to start in the midst of COVID, this general shift began to occur where entrepreneurs and the contributions that they make became villainized. And the tech community in Seattle that has been, whether it's sort of high tech, aerospace, or just technology companies in general, sort of the backbone of much of the economic growth of the state, they became the target. And you saw it with the jumpstart taxes, you saw it with the capital gains taxes, and then this kind of final millionaires tax. Really, I mean, it is the straw that broke the camel's back. We've already got an incredibly complex and multi-layered tax climate. We're, I think, 45th or 46th worst tax climate in the country before the income tax is applied. The gross receipts B&O tax on businesses, where businesses are taxed on their top line revenue, not on their profitability, is that always blew my mind as a business owner in the state. And so to then claim that there's not enough money and that the budget can't be balanced without then targeting a very specific cohort of individuals, it's enraging.
So, in recent weeks, he has been very public with his criticisms of the anti business climate in Washington state, the crushing tax burden, and now the coming pending income tax. He was on Fox News recently. So, he's getting a lot of people that are contacting him and a lot of other business owners and wealthy individuals in Washington state. He told me he's been surprised at how many of them really didn't understand that this millionaires tax is going to be crafted in such a way that future legislators could lower the threshold. It could be, down to somebody who makes a half million, then 250, then 100, then eventually an income tax on all Washington income earners. So he said it's been interesting to him, and he's glad to be part of the initiative campaign because this is going to put it out there publicly where a lot more people were finding out details of this that they didn't even know. So I asked him, in the business circles that he runs in, what are others saying about Washington's business climate and the income tax?
Everybody's leaving. And that's been the most surprising thing to me as I began speaking out, was the flood of private communication that I'm receiving from folks who have either left or are actively considered departing. And I was at an event a number of weeks back, 2 or 3 weeks ago. I tweeted about it, where it was sort of eight couples together. The event ended up being the announcement that the couple hosting had sold their house and they're on their way out. And then everybody else who was there was sort of having the same realization. And people are in various states of process, whether folks have either found places to move or just beginning to think about it. But the reality is this targeted population is incredibly mobile and doesn't want to be living in a place where they feel villainized and targeted. And so when those two things combine, and when the mayor brazenly laughs and waves them off, and the governor claims nobody's going to move, and Jamie Pedersen says there's no evidence of that happening, the reality is that just pushes everybody farther and farther to the breaking point.
And did you hear what former Governor Chris Gregoire said last week? Now, she served as our state's governor from 2005 to 2013. She had 2 consecutive terms. She's a Democrat, in case you weren't around here at that time. And last week, she was invited to speak alongside former Attorney General Rob McKenna at the Association of Washington Businesses Spring Summit. And it was very interesting when she was asked about Washington's kind of ballooning budget and the anti-business climate that has been created by the majority party.
I left office with a budget of $33 billion, and the budget today is $80 billion. I think that's a little bit too much of a growth. And yet, how we find ourselves at the end of every legislative session now is in the hole and projected to be in the hole. I would suggest to you, we don't really have an income problem, we have a spending problem. And we're answering it by stacking one more tax, one more rule, one more regulation. And the one thing that the business community doesn't need is that lack of predictability. That's how businesses grow. That's how they thrive. That's not healthy for our business community at all. As I look, unfortunately, last year at the composition of the Economic Development Committee and the House and the Senate, the one in the House was hard to find, the one in the Senate didn't exist. I asked, when did that happen? Where did the Economic Development Committee go in our state? And they heard and they created one. Why do I think those are so important? To educate regarding the consequences of the taxes. For example, sales tax on services, anti-big business. Who was hurt? Small business. Didn't understand it, didn't know it, didn't have anybody in the caucus who could explain it, nor was there a committee in which they could really begin to see the consequences of that action.
So Let's Go Washington this week did launch their initiative drive aimed at repealing the income tax. They're going to be out. They've got the next 49 days, only till July the 2nd to gather, they hope, more than 400,000 valid voter signatures to turn in. That they really only need a little bit over 300,000, but a lot of times there's duplicates or people sign when they're not a registered voter. So they have to account for some of those, throwouts from the Secretary of State's office. So off and running on this. They're confident they can get this thing done in the next 49 days. We'll keep you posted. Now, the latest on the emails obtained by the Center Square and my colleague TJ Martinell, who got nearly 1,000 pages of unredacted emails sent to him by the AG's office. These were emails between Senator Jamie Peterson, the Seattle Democrat, who's the chief architect, sponsor of the income tax bill, emails between he and the AG's office and Solicitor General Noah Purcell in the weeks when they were crafting this. And it was fast and furious back and forth, basically saying, how do we get around voters on this? How do we push this thing to have the most likely result when it ultimately reaches the state Supreme Court? And the latest in this is that the Secretary of State has asked my colleague TJ Martinell to send all those unredacted emails back. Of course, that's not our problem now, it is theirs. So more in this interesting conversation. Here is TJ Martinell and Tim Clauser.
Welcome to another episode of Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Tim Clauser, with TJ Martinell, the Center Square's Washington State investigative reporter, here to talk about the latest round of public records that TJ has gotten back from the state about the new income tax that's rolling through the courts and the state's potential legal strategy to combat it in the state Supreme Court. We know that they recently shot down a referendum. TJ has some of the behind the scenes insight into this. TJ, what records did you get in? How do you keep getting them?
Because I'm good, Tim. I'm real good. No, I got these records from the Secretary of State's office regarding the referendum on the millionaire's tax. And most of the records were redacted, but there was one draft document. It was the draft response to Let's Go Washington that the Attorney General's office was working on and that they emailed to the Secretary of State's office. And what's interesting is it contained comments between members of the Attorney General's office. And in particular, there was this one comment by Carl Smith. He's the Deputy Solicitor General, and he's writing a message to Noah Purcell, the Solicitor General. And it's very fascinating. He's talking about a certain legal argument they were going to potentially use in their response. And he says that the state Supreme Court is as favorable. This is Noah. So Noah Purcell told Carl Smith that the state Supreme Court was as favorable a venue as we're likely to get. Carl Smith, who's a former clerk for the state Supreme Court, speculated that the state Supreme Court might allow a referendum to avoid having to deal with the question of whether income is property. And the thing that I find so interesting about this, and this goes back to the story I did initially, where Noah Purcell told Senator Jamie Peterson to put in an emergency clause to prevent a referendum, right? The implication of that is that if there was a referendum, voters would reject the millionaire's tax. What Carl Smith is implying, or one could argue he's implying, is that the state Supreme Court would allow a referendum so that voters would overturn this and they wouldn't have to deal with it. So it just really goes back to show how it's just it's this unspoken open secret that if voters are given a chance to give their say on this tax, they would reject it.
Yeah,
That's
it's an interesting back and forth there. I mean, you have AGO staff saying, "Hey, look, if we want to overturn 100 years of state law saying that income is property, the state Supreme Court is as good as chance as we're going to get." And then at the same time, you have other people saying, "Hey, well, maybe they'll allow a voter referendum so they can avoid potentially weighing in on this issue in the future." I mean, ultimately, we know that they didn't do that, but it sets the stage. I mean, you have several governor appointed Supreme Court justices. Colleen Medley, I mean, she was recommended by Solicitor General Noah Purcell. She used to work underneath the governor. You have Theo Angeles he used to work with.
Yeah, and I did a story recently on how Colleen Melody met with Jamie Peterson in September. So the prime sponsor of the millionaire's tax.
Yeah, it just sets the stage. I mean, yeah, the justices will weigh in, try to remove themselves, but
yeah, I think that for people who are kind of like trying to figure out what's going on here, you have a former clerk for the state Supreme Court, basically saying that the Supreme Court might issue a legal ruling not based on whether or not a referendum should or should be allowed, but so that they can avoid dealing with a dicey legal ruling, because it's not so much, it's not an issue of whether or not it's difficult for them to rule on whether income is property, because you have all these different, Senator Peterson has spoken out against Colleton, the 1933 decision. What doesn't seem to get addressed is the fact that the state Supreme Court has taken up this issue numerous times. There was a famous state Supreme Court decision in a couple decades after Colleton where they said it's no longer a question to this court whether income is property, and that was 50, 60 years ago. And then you had a decision in 2019 where once again, the courts ruled that income is property. As a result, the progressive income tax is unconstitutional. So the reason why is because there are groups that are so hell-bent on getting this millionaire's tax enacted and then wanting a progressive income tax that, the issue is that our state Supreme Court justices are not, two of them have been appointed, but they're elected positions. So, this is not like the U.S. Supreme Court where they're appointed and they're there for as long as they basically want to be there. And they don't have to worry about the political ramifications of how they, make decisions. Whereas the state Supreme Court justices have to think about how this could affect them. So, that's the context of Carl Smith saying, yeah, they might want to punt on this and allow voters to, weigh in. But it goes back to the point that Noah Purcell said to Jamie Peterson, what Carl Smith is saying to Noah Purcell is that if voters are given a chance to weigh in, they're going to reject this tax. And there's no debate about that. And it's interesting how that's this, it's this giant elephant in the room that the public does not want this millionaire's tax. So and these emails just kind of confirm it, but it really is calling into question whether or not the Supreme, by saying this, it's calling into question the state Supreme Court's, for lack of a better word, their integrity. It's saying, oh, they might make a decision that's based on political convenience, not actually on case law. Which is not what they did. Obviously, for the record, they rejected the referendum and they cited, longstanding, unanimous legal precedent. So, they obviously didn't take that approach. But it's interesting that a former clerk for them would speculate on that.
Yeah, a former clerk for the court, and then at the same time, I mean, the AGO, the state attorney general's office, it's supposed to be working on behalf of the people that,
Right.
I mean, if you look at the data for the people that showed up at these public testimony or these public hearings for the millionaire's tax, it was overwhelmingly against the tax. Yet you have these same people who are funding this agency this attorney general's office fighting against their will, plotting behind the scenes on how to overturn nearly 100 years of legal precedent. TJ, what's next with the income tax? We know the voter referendum was rejected by the court. The court's bound to weigh in on this eventually when the lawsuit in Clickitat County Court makes its way through appeals and then to the Supreme Court. Are we going to see this on a ballot? I know there's an initiative effort that's launching from Let's Go Washington. Where are we at with this?
Well, they just launched the initiative process, so they're going to start collecting signatures. As far as this tax is concerned, I think I mean, I'm getting more records back, and I think also I could potentially be getting more records back unredacted because the Attorney General's office weighed in on these records that are, according to the Secretary of State's office, should not have been released to me. So we're going to see what's going on with that. I've got a lot of other public records requests that are pending. So we could be getting more and more information, but this is really this is really giving us a inside look at how this tax is being discussed and what's actually going on. And I'm sure for some people who are reading this or listening to this to us talk right now, that this doesn't shock them. I think what they might be missing is the fact that there's what you know intuitively, and then there's what you can prove. And these are things that we can now prove and are no longer up for debate. Like the fact that Senator Peterson's millionaire's tax is not intended to levy a tax on the wealthy and have the wealthy pay their fair share, or whatever argument they want to make. The tax was introduced to overturn a legal rule, legal precedent that does not allow progressive income tax. That is the purpose of the bill. So that's now going to shape all debates around this tax and whether it should be overturned or not. Now we've got the Attorney General's office discussing, the fact that the Supreme Court is the most favorable venue that they're going to get, and also discussing whether or not the justices will make a ruling to avoid dealing with, a 93 years of legal precedent. So, we could be getting more and more information on that. So listeners, stay tuned. It ain't over till it's over, and it's not over.
Well, DJ, we appreciate you shedding light on what's happening behind the scenes. I think a lot of people might think in the back of their head, yeah, it's normal for this stuff to go on, but it's an entirely different thing to have the records to show that is in fact actually happening. TJ, we appreciate your coverage. For anyone hoping to read that, you can catch it at thecentersquare.com. Otherwise, thank you for joining us for another episode of Washington in Focus.
And an update for you on a federal judge considering whether to toss out our state's redrawn legislative district maps, a decision that several state lawmakers and candidates for office could be impacted by ahead of this year's elections and the August primary, which is just right around the corner. You may recall a couple of weeks ago, a case out of Louisiana was ruled upon by the U.S. Supreme Court. And they basically said that Louisiana had racially gerrymandered some of their districts and that was not okay. And so this was basically throwing out some aspects of the Voting Rights Act. This impacts Washington. And even though Washington often doesn't get much of the national attention that we maybe deserve, our state was the first to have this issue. It was back after the 2020 census. And then in 2021, the Redistricting Commission kind of crafted some new, based on, updated population data, crafted new district boundaries. Everybody agreed upon that. Well, then there was a push by some Democrats, and they sent it to a federal district judge, U.S. District Judge Richard Lasnik, who then basically redrew the maps and said, no, we need to make sure that the Hispanic populations, especially in Yakima County, are thoroughly represented as a voting body. And so it threw everything into chaos. It pushed some lawmakers out of the districts that they're currently in. Well, now, given this Supreme Court ruling, we're waiting to find out if, in fact, this same judge, Lasnik, is going to come back and say, yeah, based on what the high court says, I need to revert back to how we were in 2024 before the new maps were drawn up. And this, I mean, this affects a heck of a lot of lawmakers. So you've got Republicans that are pushing him to revert to the old maps. And then you've got the Secretary of State weighing in legal filings, basically saying, don't do this. This is crazy timing. We've got the primaries coming. You're going to throw everybody into chaos. This is part of his discussion, or what his pleading, I should say, with the court not to do it. He said, this is again Secretary of State Steve Hobbs. He said, this court should not take any action that would affect the use of the existing legislative district maps for 2026 elections. These maps are currently in use. Election officials and hundreds of candidates for the Washington State Legislature have relied on those existing legislative districts. Now, meantime, you have Republican Senator Nikki Torres, who was basically drawn out of the boundaries and is in the process of moving to the Tri-Cities so that she would no longer be serving the 15th. She'd be running in the 8th legislative district as a result of this redistricting. But now you've got this decision that could put her back into her district and she may not have to move. There is so much in flux. And, you know, she talked to us a couple of weeks ago after this Supreme Court decision and said, you know, I was redistricted out. This has had a huge impact on her and her constituents. And ironically, she's Hispanic. And she was redistricted out because basically some folks on the Democratic side said being a Republican made her not truly a representative of her Hispanic constituents. Of course, she takes great issue with that, especially given the fact that we only have a matter of weeks here. There is hope that a decision will come before month's end. And so Senator Torres sent me a comment this morning when I reached back out and said, we expect this ruling any day. She believes, and she pushed back on Hobbs saying, don't throw the state into chaos. This is what she told me. She said there would still be enough time for SOS, the Secretary of State, to make changes and mail out ballots by July 16 in time for the primary. The primary does not have to be pushed back, especially if the ruling is made before the end of the month. It really shouldn't be that difficult for SOS to revert the maps. Again, it would just be going back to the maps that we had 2 years ago. And I reached out as well to GOP Chair Representative Jim Walsh of Aberdeen. He thinks there's also going to be plenty of time to revert back to the old maps, and he expects a decision any day out of Judge Lasnik's court. So this is a fairly big deal. One of the things I wanted to mention, this affects so many candidates. Who, remember, last week was the filing week for candidates running for office. And according to Washington's elections director, Stuart Holmes, I'm going to read this because it was out of the court filing. I don't want to get it wrong. He said that of the 294 people who filed last week to run for a legislative office across Washington state, 67 are seeking seats in one of the affected districts. So this impacts a whole lot of people who need to know if they're running in the new district or they're running in the old district, or do they have to relocate? This is a crazy period of time, but really important to get a decision here. And it sounds like it may be coming very soon. So thanks for tuning in. That's it for today's episode of Washington in Focus Daily for this Thursday, May the 14th. Thank you for watching. I hope you'll join us again tomorrow.